Welcome back and welcome to our first panel today titled The Big Leagues, Ramping Up the Large RAS Projects. And I'm excited to be moderating this panel today. In this panel, we will talk to executives from some of the world's largest land-based aquaculture producers. Before we begin, we'd like to do a little poll and get a sense of who our audience are today. We received some great responses and lots of attendees are coming from around the world. So please take a moment to answer this poll, which will pop up on your screen. So which of the following applies to you or your company? Exclusively in RAS production or farming, exclusively in net pen farming. You have both RAS and net pen operations. You're an investor or other. You have 30 seconds to answer. As I mentioned, we have such a diverse set of attendees today coming from about 70 countries around the world. It's a great indication of how RAS and sustainable seafood production are really gaining momentum and interest from different sectors around the world. So 33% of you are exclusively doing RAS production. 1% in net pen farming. We have both RAS and net pen operations, 10%. 6% are investor from the investor community, and 50% are others. So might be in the industry, but considering interested in recirculating aquaculture. So welcome to all of you. So now let me introduce our panel speakers for this session. First up is Martin Fothergill. Martin is the partner and co-founder of 8F Asset Management and board director of Pure Salmon. We also have Eric Heim, president of Nordic Aquafarms. Stu Holm is the CTO and co-founder of Atlantic Sapphire, and Ohad Neyman, founder and CEO of the Kingfish Company. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
Hi.
Thank you.
Glad you could join us today. So let's get started. We can, of course, let's start with the state of the sector, and let's begin the discussion by talking about the state of the sector, and we can kick that off by discussing the global pandemic, which is dominating discussions around boardroom across the world. COVID-19 saw the world shut down and the seafood farming industry pivoting and realigning production and market strategies. What have you learned from this pandemic from a business perspective? And how are your respective organizations pandemic-proofing your businesses as the potential of another pandemic or global crisis happening in the future remains a realistic assumption? So let's start the discussion with Stu, and then we'll have Martin, and then Eric, and then Ohad to respond.
Yeah. Hello. Yeah, thank you for participating. Of course, I mean, the global pandemic has affected our company, right? Because we are doing an international construction project with a lot of different partners. So this of course has been challenging, but I think we actually have handled it pretty well. It's mostly was 3 months where we had a lot of restrictions of people coming and going to the US. So yeah, it's been challenging, but we are still planning to harvest here by end of the month for the first time here in the US, and we look to be on track on that, and the world is slowly opening up. So that's really important, right?
Yeah, so I mean, we've been somewhat fortunate in the sense that we're pre-construction on most of our projects, but our facility in Poland is local production for the local market, which has been a great advantage actually, particularly when those COVID restrictions came in and imports difficult. So I think that's actually a really important point for everyone in land-based, the fact that most land-based providers are choosing to be local market operators rather than exporters. And then of course, I think we're in terms of what we see in the future. I would touch upon online trend. So I think changes that maybe we expected to see over 2 or 3 years have happened in 3 or 4 months with that huge shift to online. So that plays very well to our strategy. Similarly, there's been this big increase in home cooking. So we'll focus on that and see how that can be exploited. And then in terms of lessons learned, I mean, I think really looking forward, we're going to put a lot of focus on channel diversification, client diversification, and of course that ability to switch channels, and also not be too concentrated in any particular market as well, which I think is important.
Well, I think one of the most important things for us has been our employees and making sure we have measures in place to protect them, given that we are in 3 different countries around the world with different situations. So that's been very important, and I think it's been touched on. You know, a lot more video conferencing happening, inability to travel, and how you deal with that. So all of these things are considerations. In the US, I mean, we're seeing interesting shifts in terms of how value chains are changing or being impacted, shifts between food service and retail in consumer behavior. So it's a really interesting development that I think, you know, this industry is rapidly adapting to and learning from. And also, I think the importance of maybe local food security considerations also, where, you know, RAS farms do have some benefits in the markets where they're placed.
Well, I guess for the highest priority was indeed the health and safety of the employees. So that meant that anyone that could work from home worked from home, and we had to separate the teams of production hatchery to mitigate the risks. We were quite fortunate, both a bit of luck and a bit of planning in the diversification of channels. We're currently selling to over 14 markets, as well as the US and restaurants and retail. It did flip the priorities on their head, meaning, well, when we started the year, we intended to focus more on restaurants and slowly continue to develop retail, but we had to refocus into retail. And that did enable us to, within a matter of weeks, regain a full run rate of sales. I think that as restaurants shut down, demand in retail increased, and that was quite helpful.
Right. Yeah, it's important to note that through the global pandemic, the aquaculture industry, food production in general, though the operations sort of have been challenged with social distancing, but it has remained in operation and continued to provide that. So taking a more focused question for Martin, you have taken a different approach to your build out with your multiple locations around the world. Please talk about the rationale behind that strategy and the advantage of a bigger geographical footprint. And also on the flip side, what challenges do you come across in building multiple locations, therefore dealing with, you know, diverse set of cultural and socio-political environments?
Sure. So our overall strategy is to be a global player, but with a local footprint. So that means being able to benefit from the economies of scale of being a large player, but still be able to locate directly in multiple markets. And in a sense, that's like taking a kind of risk managed portfolio approach to the business, if you like, not putting all our eggs in one basket, if you excuse the pun. So our analysis shows that the sort of 10,000 to 20,000 tons of production facility gives you enough economies of scale at the local level, but still gives you a manageable construction project and farm, and also doesn't over concentrate market risk. So for example, you know, we don't want to be in a position where we've got to grab a really significant market share of any market to make the facility work. And I guess, you know, we weren't predicting COVID, but it does demonstrate exactly why it's important not to be too focused in one market. So look, it would be wrong to say that we haven't added a layer of complexity to what we're doing, but I don't think it's anything more than other multinational companies have who operate in multiple markets. It requires a really experienced team in global construction, a lot of organization, coordination, information flow between that central pure salmon construction team and the on-the-ground construction teams, and of course having the right local partners, service providers and contractors is absolutely key. So that's how we're going about it, and so far it's working very well.
And a follow-up to that, one of our attendees is asking how many pure salmon projects have started construction to this point.
So there's going to be 16 in total. We've got one that's in production, and then there's several that are actually all very, very close to starting construction, so they're in pre-construction.
Now, a question to Eric. Eric, you recently launched an infomercial that aired or will air on CNN and eventually on public television that really explains what land-based aquaculture is all about. What outcomes are you hoping to achieve from these television spots, and why was it important to invest in this infomercial?
So I think if we take the American perspective of this, I think there's a lot more information that could be shared with the public about where the aquaculture industry is and where it's going. And it's not just for RAS, but we happen to be in the RAS space, so that's where we operate. And I think also allowing people to get some visual perspective on what these farms are about is valuable for people. And also maybe to sort out some of the confusion and myths surrounding what this is and is not. So our company has over time invested in a range of media activities, and I think we have 5 productions behind us in terms of video. So I think in terms of outcomes, as I'm thinking, it's really maybe creating more positivity around the aquaculture industry as a whole in the U.S. And also more public awareness and an opportunity to address the myths and where the industry is going. And to be frank, these investments that we have done had not been significant in the bigger picture. So I think it's about creating more excitement around the whole industry, and obviously we benefited from it, but I also think colleagues here also, as we all take turns on doing this, we all will benefit from raising awareness around where this industry is going, given the great potential in the U.S. in years to come.
Right. And keeping it in the U.S. front too, could you give us an update on the planned harvest at the Miami Blue House facility, and what are the projections?
Yeah, I mean, as I said earlier, we are planning to start harvesting here of the month, and we're ready for that. Our Blue House is almost finished in construction, right? And we are stocking the systems and slowly ramping up production for our local partners in the whole US. And I think this is one of the things where we disagree a little bit with Martin in relation to how to put so many different facilities, because we can see so much how more knowledge intensive this is and how difficult it is to scale, big scale, to be able to supply the demand that's going to be in the US. I mean, as we talked about before, in the COVID times, we see a huge amount of customers starting to cook salmon at home, right? So the COVID is doing is that it's teaching people to cook salmon at home, which it generally was eaten in restaurants before, right? And as we heard before, permitting and building huge facilities is not that easy. So by having our local Blue House here in Miami, where we basically can build as much as capacity as we want, because the permitting is not a limit, we see that as a huge advantage. And that also goes to the human resources and how we can build up the knowledge and have the best people at site all the time. And of course, if you were in places where there were big barriers and so on, but we see North America as one big market where we can be supplying all from here from one site within 2 days of trucking, right?
Well, we have a follow-up question from our audience. Mr. Hood, with all the existing and planned RAS operations in North America, the 90% of all salmon being imported, do you agree that competition will be on quality and not price?
I think it can be both. Of course, it's very important to it's not only on quality. I think when it comes to price, it's very much also about technology and how to produce the salmon, right? And what we see is that we've done it for 10 consecutive years, where we slowly have developed the RAS technology step by step, right? And really taking it to the next level. But it's also very much depending on skills, right? So yes, I think there will at some point be a competition on price, but we're just seeing the increase in demand in the US being so big that we think quality is also going to be a very, very important point.
For OHAD, most of the large-scale commercial RAS projects are for salmon production, but you're scaling up your yellowtail RAS production as you expand your market. Can you talk about the rationale behind the decision to go for a different species that have less of a track record than salmon in terms of farming, and let alone farming them in land?
Of course. I think first, looking at the macro, at the development of almost any technology, I think that often the first challenge is to make it work. But then the second, as important one, is what kind of rollout strategy it is utilized in. In our view, RAS in the last few years, in many ways, thanks to some of my colleagues here as well, has proven that it crossed the Rubicon from an experimental to a commercially viable technology. On the second question, however, of what product in what market, we often joke that we have borrowed a page from the Tesla playbook, where in a sense the yellowtail is our Model S. It is a high-value species that allows us to comfortably operate our systems at this point. And whether in the future we would look into, I guess the Model 3 would be a salmon or more mid-market, or we continue to look at other high-value species is to be seen. But we were trying to look at how to best utilize the strategic advantages of the technology. And in our view, it is the ability to make quite sustainable choices in the feed, in the energy, and in best practices. It is the ability to replace imports. So we focus on products that are not locally available at our target market. And of course, it is critical that the species performs well. What gave us quite some comfort going into yellowtail is my co-founder and the actual RAS expert or farmer in the group, Kees Kloet. He has dedicated his 30 years career into RAS, and in the last 10 years specifically focused on yellowtail. I've heard that there's a saying that you have to kill 1 million fish in RAS before you know what you're doing, and luckily I met him when he was done killing fish.
We have another question from our audience. For those operating in the U.S. or plan to operate in the U.S., what have been the bigger or the biggest regulatory barriers to launching your operations? Let's start with you, Eric.
Regulatory barriers, I think it totally depends on your location and regulatory regime you're in. If you take, so we're operating in Norway, Denmark, and the US. They all have different regulatory systems. And then it comes down to your specific site location, which has different permitting, issues and potentially different permitting agencies involved depending on the scope of the project and permitting sector authorities and so on. So I think in the end, it's really unique to every project, and that's where I think as you build experience across different permitting regimes, you become more, let's say, experienced in preparing for what you have up ahead and also getting through the process in a sensible manner. There are a lot of parallels between permitting, for example, in Europe and the US, but it is different also. So, and we see the same in the US. We are present in Maine and California. There are different permitting regimes there. So I think this is a part of the learning process and journey for every company going into this, and also taking that into account when you start looking at your site locations, what it involves.
Anybody else has anything to add to that?
I think that Eric is right. That the permitting here is very complex, and we look at when we were doing the site searching for finding the Atlantic sapphire site, we were looking in many different places, and we saw that sometimes it was up to 14 different, 21 different agencies involved, and with high political risk and all these kinds of things. And that's why we chose Florida, right? Is because we can get good amount of water out of the ground from a very standardized permitting procedure, where we also can get allowed to put it back into the ground through these injection wells, right? And this makes the whole permitting much more easier,
So let's switch to challenges and opportunities. So there's currently an appetite in the investor community for sustainable food production in general, and RAS in particular. Could you talk about your experiences raising capital and what are the key success factors for capital building? Martin, let's start with you, and then Ohad, and then Eric, and then Tu.
Okay, so look, we chose to go down the private route, private equity route, which has actually been pretty successful for us. We raised $360 million in a private equity fund for our first 4 facilities, and we actually got some really prestigious investors in that raise, including 3 sovereign wealth funds. I mean, there's pros and cons of going down, private versus public, and I guess private company versus private equity fund. One of the big advantages of private capital is you have long-term strategic investors that really understand what you do. They've got the right time horizon and the right level of patience to see out these projects. As we all know, they take many years to come to fruition. And as a company, of course, that gives us time to develop and mature the company at the right pace, and ahead of any potential exit. And it does let us do that in kind of relative privacy as well, without the public reporting requirements or scrutiny of a listed company. Although we are, very transparent with our investors, and of course we like to join events like this, so everybody knows what we're doing. But also, I think the private equity funds also access a segment of the market that other routes can't access. I mean, there's a lot of investors out there that only invest through private equity funds. So I think we've also had access to that segment.
Yeah, I think when I think of it, it's both a matter of progress and general market environment. When we started, we had to look for basically seed investors with the vision and the willingness to take a risk on a system we haven't built, on a fish we haven't raised, and on a market we haven't proven. I think that the further you go and you're able to show receipts and answer these major concerns, we have seen that we have been able to attract better fundraising options and progressively more professional industry investors, to the point that today such investors such as Nutreco, Rabobank, or Creadev are looking at our key performance indicators. And a key criteria there is, for example, to make sure that if you design a system for 1,000 ton, it produces 1,000 and more, because if it produces substantially less, then the Excel is less valuable.
Well, I guess it's just worth taking into perspective that we are all here working in an emerging industry. There's been some very, successful and good placements in the market this year. But I think it's also important to understand, for the audience, is that most of those are supported by, fairly strong capabilities and experience. And we see a lot of new projects coming up, and it's not really a free lunch out there. It takes hard work building stone upon stone and building that learning curve and the proof of concept and capabilities really to take the step to scale. So I think most of us here started small scale, right? And it's a journey where you have to go that learning curve. And, whether you go private or public and so on, that's a decision any company will have to look at and make their own decisions. But I think the good news is the capital is out there for the right players, and that's very encouraging for this segment, because I think we're going to see a tremendous development in the coming 5 years from a number of companies, and that should broaden the field for other players in the future as well.
And Tu?
Yeah, I'm not the CFO or the managing director of the company, so this is of course something I've been involved in. But for us, we are the only listed company, right? And this group, and we of course see great advantages of that in relation to accessing a lot of capital funds and pension funds, and eventually maybe also, as was talked about before, green bonds and these kinds of things, right? And the transparency, we are very happy with that, and we don't have a problem with that, and that's it keeps us on our edge, and yeah, I mean we just did 100 million last week, right? So it looks that was very oversubscribed. So I think the environment for this is very good, and especially as Eric says, is if you have the track record and you can show what you've done in the past, then it makes it really much easier, right?
Yeah, definitely. So I want to get back to you, Eric, something you touched on earlier, and that's technology the capability. And you, as a company, has made a decision to develop internal capability for your technology and your designs. Can you talk about the rationale for that and having the in-house capability as opposed to having a third-party vendor for your design, for your technology and systems design?
I think it partially depends on what stage of development you are in and the maturity of your organization. Obviously, if you're doing your first project, it's not really feasible to do that, right? But I think it's from our learning curve over the past 6-7 years, working with a range of vendors and so on. And for us, like I mentioned, this is an emerging industry, so we're seeing an innovation pace which results in a lot of iterations and a continuous improvement, which I'm sure everybody here is also working on. Taking out coordination costs of that process has a high value. Also, the fact that a lot of RAS vendors have capacity issues with a lot of requests for projects. So we're basically doing a couple of things: taking out the risk related to vendor support and capacity issues on the RAS side of things. And the other thing is the very close interaction we see day to day between our internal design team and our fish people and engineers. So that's allowed us to have a lot of pretty rapid iterations on things that otherwise, in some cases, may not have been so easy with a traditional vendor.
And two, I want to ask you, as your build in Miami gets nears completion, what were your primary and most important technical and strategic considerations in the initial stages of developing the systems, technology, and overall design of the Miami Blue House project? And 2 years into the construction phase, what have been the biggest challenges in the construction and keeping to the scheduled timelines?
I mean, that's a big topic. I mean, how long time do we have? But I mean, I think the most important thing is to build a strong construction team. Here we've hired a lot of people in our construction team to localize the project, right? That's super important. US is very different from Europe, and you can't just apply the other things. We have done a lot of things. We are doing a lot of our own things inside the farm. We're not only relying on one vendor. We are, of course, using one main supplier for the RAS system, but we are doing a lot of other things ourselves. And as Eric says, that's probably a progress that's going to continue going forward, right? And in relation to the technology, we were planning already on forehand, because we know that good water that's biosafe is very important, and that we always can get rid of the water is very important. And we work a lot with denaturfication and other technologies inside our farm, but the availability of water is super important for making a successful project, and then you have the access for it, both for the water quality and for getting the right flavor and all of these things, right?
So another key consideration, I think, with the technology design is feed. And OHAD, as the only one in the panel that's farming a different species, I want to ask you about some of the challenges that around optimizing feed for yellowtail in RAS environments. Because your team, I believe, has been involved in developing feed formulations for your purposes. What progress have you had in this area, and what challenges remain in terms of commercially available optimal feed for the yellowtail in RAS?
I think if I have any advice I could give someone starting is not to make the mistake we made in experimenting with producing our own feed too early. In early days, we thought it was a good idea to formulate organic certified formula that was nutritionally very capable, but we learned the hard way that the critical effects of feeding a RAS system, which may not be such a challenge in net pans, is both the palate integrity, which means that if it is not just right, not too hard for the fish not to be able to eat it, but not breakable to the point that it creates dust in the system, that's a very important factor. And the other important factor, of course, is the effect on the feces of the fish, because the system has to remove it. So we have since we have experimented early on and learned it the hard way, we have been sticking to both proven formulas by some of the leading suppliers in the market. We constantly experiment with different variations of feed. We have a partnership on R&D with Skretting due to their investment by Nutreco, where we are looking to better the formulas. But at this point, everything we do before we put it into a large-scale use goes through rigorous small-scale R&D testing on particularly the effects of water quality and feces.
I'd like to bring in one question from the audience, and maybe Thu, you can answer this. How do the panelists balance the increased efficiency intensification with RAS along with preserving animal welfare, particularly with higher stocking densities?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that we have been looking a lot at in a lot of years, right, with looking at the fish. And one of the things that we can do when we are in a controlled environment is we can control how the fish swim, right? And this is super important in relation to have the higher stocking densities. When you look at a stocking density that where we go to close to 90 kilos per cubic meter, it is actually not that dense compared to a net pen. You can easily see the fish swimming at more than that in net pens in certain areas of the net pen. Of course, the average stocking density in the net pen is not that. But why is this lowest stocking density in net pens down to 25 kilos per cubic meter? It's because that there's a natural current, and you can't count on that natural current all the time, and therefore you don't control it, and therefore you can't go above 25 cubic meters. It's not a animal welfare issue in relation to how the stocking density is if the water parameters are there, right? So as long as you keep a good environment where you keep your CO2, a good water exchange in the tank with a lot of flow to the fish and good swimming speeds, and have low ammonia, low CO2, good oxygen in the tank, few particles, few bacteria that irritates the gills, clear water, then it's absolutely no problem for the salmon to be in those densities. And you can, for example, see the fish that we harvest has beautiful fins, very few damages, and beautiful bodies, right? And that's normally often if you have welfare problems, you will see a lot of damage to the fish. And we've made cortisol tests on the fish, and we don't see any increased stress with densities in the levels we are working with.
Okay, so we'll move on to our next topic, and it's the future. One of the challenges for RAS operators currently is the relative lack of skilled professionals with specific expertise and experience in large-scale production in RAS environments. How can this industry build up capacity for skilled talent, and how can we attract more young people to go into this profession? Martin, let's start with you, and then Eric, and then Ohad, and then Thu.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think we all have a responsibility to try and build out the skills in our sector. And we've got an initiative called the Pure Salmon Academy, which is focused entirely on staff training. So we're focusing a lot on crossover training. So, bringing people in maybe that have RAS experience but not experience of salmon, or vice versa, and really trying to build on those skill gaps to have well-rounded people. We're doing that at some level through online and classroom training, but principally using our Polish facility as an on-the-ground training center. And we've also got one for processing staff. And also, we're thinking about how do you attract staff in the first place, but also critically, how do you retain them? And we think that's about making sure we're recruiting as much as possible, very, very locally to the facilities, where obviously people have their families and they're much likely to want to stay with the company and grow with the company long term.
Eric, you have anything to add?
Martin has a lot of good points. Obviously, what sort of the characteristic of these farms is that you really have a wide sort of range of type of competencies involved in an operation at scale, right? So you're talking, from administrative to engineering to fish production to product quality issues and so on. So there's a wide range of type of people you need to attract. So obviously, I think all of our businesses here, we're going to be reaching across industries and finding expertise as this business grows. And also, clearly, workforce development initiatives like Martin is talking about will be important. And cooperation was mentioned earlier. For example, in our locations, work with academic institutions. Ohad and us happen to have business in the same state in the US. In the future, I think critical mass will matter in terms of interest from academic institutions and so on. And one of our key sort of criteria when we search for sites is to centralize them as much as possible. It was mentioned remote locations for aquaculture earlier, and that is a barrier for some people. So if you have nice communities for people to live in, proximity to cities and things like that, it does take down some barriers in terms of attracting and retaining people. So it's clearly a focus all of us are working on, and I think you have to start with a strong core and expand from there and work in partnerships with many different parties as you grow as a business.
Ohad?
Yeah, I think from our perspective, we see the challenge mostly in the RAS specialties. Because of course we need administration and sales and marketing as well, but the one in short supply seems to be the RAS expertise, and we work on tackling it from two perspectives. One is close cooperation with universities. In the Netherlands, we work with Wageningen University, in Maine with the University of Maine, which are some of the few that already have a program for RAS in their activities. And we are looking for ways to further develop their programs so that we can assist there. And other part is, of course, training our own additional personnel. Over the last few years, some young aquaculture students that started with us have been trained to the point that today we can leave them in charge for a night or a weekend as a shift manager. And we interchange between facilities. So we now already operate a hatchery in Maine. The 4 full-time employees that are there spend some time in the Netherlands to get hands-on training before they started setting up there.
And two, maybe you can talk about how, like in your RAS facility in Miami, you're hiring strategies for hiring the right talent for that facility.
Yeah, of course, I agree with many of the things that's been set up above, and universities and all of the strategies. And then, of course, for us, it's that we will have one big site that we don't need so many skilled people, especially in RAS, right? That you have the experts on site, you have the people that take care of the fish and so on. But one thing, Ohad also has said before, and we have been focusing on in the many last years, is SOPs. Very well documented SOPs where you can, where all our experience and everything goes in. Of course, that goes through the Sapphire Academy and all of these trainings. But I agree that it's the RAS specialists that will be the limiting factor, finding people that has the experience. There's a lot of experience in relation to managing these systems and understanding the complexity and effects of these things, right? And I think that's also where AI is going to help even more. Many things we don't understand today is through our AR programs. We are getting a lot of good data out on what is cause and effect of different things and getting that into people. So it's two things. It's really training your staff in RAS from all the experienced people we already have through our training programs and SOPs, and then getting much wiser on how these systems are operating and getting some optimization into these processes, and then be very, very strict with the SOPs. That's very important.
What I want to ask you, as you prepare or get full speed ahead with your North American expansion, still looking to the future, what were some of the factors or criteria that you considered in developing your strategies for location selection and systems and technology design?
I think from the macro perspective, the U.S. market was on our target list from early on, as a lucrative seafood market that is largely dependent on imports. When we started looking at the U.S., we chose to focus first on the East Coast, frankly, because it was a little easier to manage from the Netherlands than the West Coast, but both could be an interesting alternative. And as we looked through possibilities in the East Coast, of course, for us, our first technical priority is access to clean seawater, so that we make sure we are far away from either industrial or other farming potentials for pollution. Additional pluses for Maine were quite a strong local support that we've seen in our chosen location, as well as enjoying some of the benefits of a developed logistic cold chain and overall seafood tradition. I think that lastly, the main brand name added as well. That's it's about the high-level process.
And Eric, you're also getting your California build underway. What were some of the lessons you learned or are learning from the main process that you're applying to your project in California?
Well, I guess we've had a learning curve that basically started in Europe, in Norway and Denmark some years back, and next step was coming to the US. So every location is different, like I said before. But I think the learning curve in general is, for example, the step from Europe to US. It is a different regulatory system, and of course, having gone through a process in Maine, even though it's not the same as some West Coast states, it does give a lot of experience that prepares you for process. And of course, in our case, we've done a lot of engineering in Maine and benefit greatly from that on the West Coast as we work in modular designs. So those are some of the significant benefits. And of course, also the fact that we have a base in the US now makes it easier to go even further away to the West Coast. It is a long distance from Norway to California. So even if you live in the US, it's a long distance, right? So I think just it's again this stone up on stone, leveraging your learning curve in the US market, and using that as you progress, like probably Sapphire's been doing as they're looking at expansion too in one location. So I think it's just there's a lot of learning happening every step of the way in these projects, and the more experienced players become, the more prepared they are to plan for them and also deal with them.
Right. And speaking of expansion, let's expand further. So Martin, you've said that your next big focus will be on China. Why China, and what makes it right for RAS?
I think China is simply a market that can't be ignored. I mean, China is a third of all global seafood consumption. It's 7 times larger than North America in terms of seafood consumption, and we all know it's already the 6th largest salmon consumer in the world, and of course that's nearly all imported, subject to transportation costs and import duties. The market for salmon's been growing massively in China, and it's been growing about 16% compound for the last 10 years. And even after all that growth, its per capita consumption is absolutely tiny. It's like 0.1 of a kilogram per year compared to like 1.3 in the US or 8 kilograms in Norway. So the growth potential there is enormous, and also the level of technology and infrastructure around online commerce is way ahead of much of the world. And of course, this is going to be even more important now in a post-COVID situation. And to put it in perspective, actually, seafood's already the second largest online food category in China, which makes it an enormous opportunity. So I think all of these things just add up to China being a hugely compelling story for RAS farmers going to China and locating on the ground.
Well, I think we're nearing the conclusion of our session. I just have one last question for everyone. If you could answer maybe in under 40 seconds, what obstacles still remain, in your opinion, that can potentially hinder the progress and proliferation of land-based aquaculture, and how do we overcome those challenges? Let's start with Tu, then Eric, then Ohad, then Martin.
I mean, it's as we talked today, it is really, I think it's really the competence and getting good people that understand the technology and both design, growing the fish in these conditions is really what's gonna limit the industry to grow fast enough, right? And as Martin is talking about China here and there and all of these places, right? It is a lot of people to do a lot of projects at the same time, and doing that, I think it's really having the right people that can do these things is really what's gonna limit the growth going forward.
Eric?
Sure. So I think it's a little bit about obviously this industry is still on a learning curve, so it's also about of course some of the companies sitting here now have a key role in actually sort of clearing the path as we move up the proof of concept curve, right? So it comes a little bit down to all of us really creating realistic expectations in the market, maturing this responsibly, and also, like Tu is saying, making sure that we develop a skilled workforce, because that's a key ingredient in making this successful. It's just not the technology. So I think it's a responsible management of the learning curve now. I think that will bring this to success. There will be some bumps on the road. That happens in every emerging industry, but as long as these things are managed professionally and communicated transparently, I think this sector has a bright future.
Ohad?
Yeah, I think as well that it's important to keep proving the commercial viability of this technology, but to some extent, when I look at other sectors, should be also important to focus on, I don't have to call it social environmental license as well. There's a claim we make, which I think is very important and we need to live up to, that it is one of the most sustainable methods or technologies to raise fish. And I think we will be evaluated on that front as well.
And Martin?
And I would actually echo what Eric said. I mean, there's a lot of people sat on the sidelines watching and waiting, particularly the big incumbent players, and the responsibility really lies with the four of us on this panel and some others to demonstrate to everyone that land-based salmon farming or land-based farming works and is profitable. There are going to be bumps in the road, but ultimately that's what we need to do. And then I think there's going to be a real change in the industry, and we're going to see land-based take its rightful position right there in the mainstream.
All right. And on that note, we have to end our session, and I would like to thank all of you again in this panel for taking the time to join us in this important discussion and for sharing your insights and experiences. Thank you, Martin, Eric, and Tu, and Ohad for joining us.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting us.
Okay.